Hi everyone. So today we're going to look at question 4 of the Conceptual Framework question bank. So this question was a prior class test question of 2019. It was a 30-mark question, which means you had 45 minutes to complete the question. 30 marks are a lot of marks for conceptual framework question, which means that the required would probably be something more than just the normal definition of one of the elements. And we will see that now when we read the required. You should let the marks guide you in terms of how much you write. So let's read the required. Given the terms of the seed funding mentioned above, discuss the initial recognition of the seed funding in the startup company's accounting records in terms of the conceptual framework for financial reporting. So the first thing that you should realize here is that it asks you to discuss the initial recognition. So here we should go and establish what initial recognition actually is. This is different from classification. So classification is about the definition of your elements, so of the assets, liabilities, equity, etc. However, initial recognition includes classification, but is also about your recognition criteria, which is relevance and faithful representation. So if they ask you for the initial recognition, then you should discuss classification and the recognition criteria. If they only ask you to discuss the classification, you would only do the definition of the element that is applicable. The second thing you should notice is that they ask you in terms of the startup company's accounting records. So be careful here that you do not discuss it in terms of the investor's accounting records. One of the most important things to read in this question is the note. So many of you think that the things in the notes is only like generic things. For example, you should round off to 1 rand, etc. But in a conceptual framework question, the note is usually very, very important and can save you a lot of time if you read it carefully. It gives very, very important information. So it says, do not discuss the debit entry at initial recognition, which means the debit entry is your bank. So you should not discuss the bank. You should discuss the credit entry. So the credit entry of this would be the liability. It also asks you not to define the term recognition. So this means when you go and look at your standard, you should not discuss paragraph 5.1 to paragraph 5.5. It says, do not discuss the units of the account of the right or obligation. So this means paragraph 4.4a to paragraph 4.55 is not applicable. Assume that the benefit of recognizing the seed funding, if applicable, outweighs the cost of recognition thereof. Therefore, do not discuss the cost constraints of recognition decisions. This is paragraph 5.8. Only discuss the application of qualitative characteristics insofar as they are directly applicable, if at all, to answering this required. So this is in terms of your relevance and your faithful representation. So we'll get back to that later. Assume that the substance of the rights or obligations are clear from the legal form. Therefore, do not discuss substance over form considerations. This is your paragraph 4.59 to 4.62. Also, assume there is no measurement uncertainty. Therefore, do not discuss measurement uncertainty, which is paragraph 5.19 to paragraph 5.23. So, if you did not read the note carefully, you would have ended wasting a lot of time writing these paragraphs down, and you would not receive any marks for it, and you would probably not finish with a question. So let's take a quick look at the information given. So it is clear from the first 2 paragraphs that this is your background information. It is there to give you a background on what the question is going to be about, but not necessarily carrying any information that you would use to answer the question. So the next paragraph is the important one. So what is clear from the information given is that the company borrows money from the outside investors, and this funding is called seed funding. When the startup company is sold eventually, then this money is repaid to the investors. The only way that they are not going to repay this amount is when it fails and is no longer considered a going concern. So after you've read the information and the required, it is important to go and plan your answer. So you know that the required asked for the initial recognition of the credit entry. So this means that you would have to go and write about the definition of the liability, as well as your recognition criteria, which is relevance and faithful representation, and then ultimately to conclude whether the startup company should recognize the seed funding as a liability in their financial statements. While you plan your answer, it is important to remember the notes in the required, because otherwise you're going to write things that were not required. So keep that in mind. And then also, in terms of the format for your conceptual framework questions, you should always go and write the applicable theory, and for each theory paragraph or concept, you would have to go and write the application. So you would write theory, application, theory, application, theory, application, etc., until you can then do your conclusion. So let's look at the solution to see how you should have answered the required. So as you can see, here you have your theory and your application of your classification, which is your definition of your liability. If you go down after the conclusion where you've concluded that it is in fact a liability, you have your theory and application of your recognition criteria, which is your relevance and your faithful representation. And after that, you have your conclusion. So for each theory part or paragraph, you should have an application. But remember, you should only write the applicable theory. Many of you just go and write all the paragraphs, and not all the paragraphs are applicable, and then in the end, you are wasting a lot of time. So specifically when you do your planning, read the different paragraphs in your standard and decide which ones are the most applicable to this specific question. And then for each theory part, you have your application. So for example, here is your 4.29 and your 4.33. And here is your application of those two paragraphs. So paragraph 4.29, its application is this first part over here. And then paragraph 4.33's application is then the remaining of that. So you can see for each concept, etc., you would have your application that you write. And this is throughout the entire solution. So for example, this paragraph here is the application for that. So remember to go and do that in this format, and not just to write all the theory and then at the end the application. Because if you don't have enough time to do that and you only write the theory, you would not receive that many marks. When applying the theory of a liability, you should have discussed whether there is an obligation, could there be a transfer of economic resources, and is there a present obligation as a result of past events. However, one of the things that many students forget as part of their discussion is what is the economic resource that is being transferred. Because according to this part of your definition of your liability, the obligation must have the potential to require the entity to transfer an economic resource to another party. So, you have to go and discuss whether what is being transferred is in fact an economic resource. And this part is contained in your definition of your asset. So the economic resource that could potentially be transferred in this scenario is the initial seed funding from the tech accelerator using its bank accounts and related cash. So the potential economic resource is the bank account and its related cash of the startup company. And that is why you have to go and write whether this bank account and related cash is in fact an economic resource. And so in the solution, that is why they wrote about what is an economic resource, the right, control, and potential to produce economic benefits, to prove that the bank and related cash is in fact an economic resource that could potentially be transferred. Another thing that I want to point out is that in the note, it said that only discuss the application of qualitative characteristics insofar as they are directly applicable, if at all, to answering the required. And that is why, in terms of your discussion about the qualitative characteristics, relevance, and faithful representation, you did not have to write that much application. So, for example, recognition of liability may not always provide relevant information if it is uncertain whether a liability exists. A liability exists, but the probability of an outflow of economic benefits is low. And from the above discussion of the definition of a liability, it is clear that a liability exists. So you only should have said this. You shouldn't have gone and written more about relevance, etc., because it is not directly applicable to this scenario. And the same goes for your faithful representation. It says whether faithful representation can be provided may be affected by the level of measurement uncertainty associated with the asset or by other factors. So your other factors is where the directly applicable comes into account. Those are not directly applicable to the scenario, and that is why you shouldn't have discussed the other factors. Then also, you shouldn't have discussed the measurement uncertainty, because in the note, it specifically said that you should assume there is no measurement uncertainty, and therefore you should not discuss anything about measurement uncertainty.